Ned, you heard the president's words there about Marco Rubio and that dual role. You've worked at the State Department with the National Security Council as well as at the CIA, and this at the highest levels. How sustainable is that dual role, and at what point could it risk national security?
Well, Chris, Alex, very simply, it's not sustainable. And there's a good reason it hasn't been done since the age of Henry Kissinger. 2025 is not 1975. The issues are more numerous. They're more complex. They're in many ways more consequential. And to say that one individual is in a position to do both jobs, I think fundamentally misunderstands what these jobs are. Something would have to give if Marco Rubio is going to be in both of these positions for a long time. And my concern is that it would be our national security. Both jobs are really two jobs in one. So you're talking about four portfolios here. The National Security Advisor is the top aide to the president, responsible for advising the president every day, waking him up at night if there's a national security crisis, but then also responsible for the interagency. That is to say, the other departments and agencies that play a role in our foreign policy and national security, coordinating them, adjudicating decisions, getting to agreement on the most consequential issues there are. Secretary of State is also more than a 24/7 job. Not only are you our nation's top diplomat, responsible for traveling the globe, meeting with other foreign ministers, presidents, prime ministers, but you're also leading an agency of some 80,000 men and women, foreign service officers, civil servants, and on the line. So to say that one person can sustainably do these two jobs, to say that one person can even do these two jobs for a very short period of time, I think it sacrifices our national security in the name of expediency for this White House.
Yeah, you'd certainly think that his travel as the top emissary for the United States around the globe would have to be curtailed to some level. So, John, your latest co-authored article suggests, beyond so-called Signalgate, Mike Waltz's hawkish approach to Iran may have been ultimately what cost him the job. So tell us about that. And did Waltz advise to bomb Iran?
That's right. So Michael Waltz was very much in favor of military options for addressing Iran's nuclear program over diplomatic options. He viewed this as a moment where Iran's missile defense infrastructure had been weakened. And it was a moment where the Israelis, especially Prime Minister Netanyahu, very much wanted to conduct these strikes against the Iranians. And he viewed it as the window was closing, and the Iranians could build back their missile defense infrastructure. And this was a time to work with the Israelis ahead of time on presenting options to the president, which were military options. And so that included discussions with Netanyahu, with his aide, Ron Dermer. And the fact that there was this close coordination did irritate the president and some officials in the administration. Obviously, it wasn't as devastating and catastrophic as Waltz's accidental fat fingering a journalist into a group chat on sensitive military matters. But it was one of the things that irritated the president and just showed that he is more ideologically out of step with the president, a little bit more hawkish, a little bit more in favor of military intervention, and ultimately, these were the types of cleavages that resulted in Waltz getting, he said in that interview, it's not a punishment, but it's a de facto demotion. The National Security Advisor is nowhere near as powerful, as influential as the UN ambassador, should he be confirmed.
Look, Ned, I mean, irritated for the president to feel that way. Should he have been fired for advocating to bomb Iran?
Well, look, Alex, I think this points to a larger challenge this administration is facing. They have, as John put it, these ideological cleavages that really run the gamut from traditional mainstream Republicans' hawkish views on issues like Iran to the more isolationist wing of the Republican Party, if you can even call it that anymore, because it's really the MAGA movement rather than the Republican Party, that are led by people like J.D. Vance and in some ways Donald Trump. And so it was always going to be a challenge when you put all of these people together without any sort of ideological coherence. And Alex, that is why precisely you need a national security council. One of the key takeaways for me in John's excellent reporting was the fact that there are individuals in this White House, reportedly, who think that this president doesn't need a national security council, or at least doesn't need an empowered national security council. Well, to me, that betrays a fundamental, again, misunderstanding of what the National Security Council is and naivete about the world. You may not need a national security council or an empowered national security council when you're signing EOs on, banning paper straws or renaming the Gulf of Mexico. But you do and you will need a National Security Council when there's a terrorist attack. You will need a National Security Council when you're adjudicating issues like Iran's nuclear program. And the fact that this administration has been all over the map, to cite one example, about what Iran can and cannot have, whether it can enrich on its soil, whether it can't enrich on its soil, whether it can have enriched uranium but needs to import it. That is just one, I think, example of the total lack of process in the policy and ideological incoherence that the American people are seeing, and in some ways, much more dangerously, the rest of the world is seeing. It's only a matter of time before our adversaries attempt to take advantage of this administrative chaos.
Gotta say, very sobering answers from the both of you right there. Let me pivot to you, Yamiche, because I'm reminded of points that you've made twice now, and also during that interview on a number of occasions. The president is touting Marco Rubio. What do you think is driving that? Because it's not exactly what you'd expect because of their history. And you noted when he talks about who would be his successor potentially, he says Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance in that order.
Well, it is really interesting if you look at the arc of Marco Rubio's career and his relationship with President Trump. Of course, he started really as an adversary. President Trump at one point was calling him Little Marco, making fun of him. But now he's seen as someone, by President Trump's own description, as someone who's both loyal to him, but also someone who's doing a good job in his administration. So the president seems very, very pleased with Marco Rubio. I think it's striking that he said Marco Rubio, as you pointed out, before he said Vice President J.D. Vance's name when it came to talking about successors and who could be the next president for the Republican Party if they were to win another election. So I think it shows you that Marco Rubio has really done some work to feel as though, to make President Trump feel as though he's someone who he trusts, someone who he feels like he can put in multiple jobs, and someone who feels like he won't complain and sort of do anything that will be seen as sort of contrary to what President Trump wants him to do. I think about the fact that Marco Rubio was in that sort of explosive Oval Office meeting between President Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, and the one with President Trump, where they essentially berated President Zelensky and got into that fight. Marco Rubio was sitting on that couch, but he was very quiet and watching the room. Mm-hmm. And then maybe in some ways that's what President Trump appreciates about him in this moment.
Ned, among the ground covered in the Meet the Press interview, Russia, Ukraine, Iran, the national security changes. In light of all that, former National Security Advisor John Bolton said this about one of the principal figures in Trump's foreign policy roles now, Steve Witkoff. Take a listen.
I mean, if you look at Witkoff, he doesn't know anything about Ukraine. He doesn't know anything about Russia. He doesn't know anything about Iran. He doesn't know anything about nuclear weapons. He doesn't know anything about arms control and nonproliferation. And he doesn't know anything about state-to-state negotiation. Really, it's hard to imagine a less qualified person. And yet he is Trump's personal envoy.
Yeah, he's a real estate guy. So, Ned, given the potential dire nature of the situation with Iran and the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict, how much faith do you put in Witkoff's ability to help resolve these matters?
Alex, I never like to be on the same side as John Bolton on any issue, but it's hard to disagree with what he is saying here. These are some of the most complex issues that the foreign policy establishment of the United States government is dealing with. And a reminder, Witkoff's portfolio has only grown and grown, whereas he started with Russia, whereas he started with the Middle East, which is itself more than a full-time job. It has now expanded to include Russia, Ukraine, and to now include Iran. Let's take those last two. The Iranian nuclear challenge is itself a geopolitical challenge. It is a political challenge, but it's also a technical challenge involving nuclear physics and safeguards that you need the foremost experts of the United States government to be on. Steve Witkoff, again, just as we heard from John Bolton, is a real estate developer. 4 months ago, he was in the real estate business. And to say that he is not capable of doing it, it's not a reflection of him. It's a reflection of human nature. You can't go from a real estate developer to engaging with some of the most tenacious and skilled negotiators in the Iranian negotiators that we're going to face. Same is true as Russia and Ukraine. My fear is that he's treating this as a real estate dispute and not the really values-laden conflict involving democracy, freedom, sovereignty, territorial integrity that the United States needs to treat it with. And I feel the results will be reflective of that.